Let's check out what Sarah spends in New York City as a 27-year-old.
This is an updated follow-up to a video that I did 2 years ago, which was what I spent in a week. But today we're doing what I spent in a month. And I wanted to do this video because a commonly asked question that I get on my channel is how much do I spend in a month? How expensive is it living in New York City? And before we get into it, I do want to say that living in New York City is different for every single person. I mentioned this in my last what I spent in a week, but I just wanted to say that again and reiterate that New York City is a very expensive city. I think it's the most expensive, if not one of the most expensive cities to live in.
She brings up a really good point that wherever you're living, there can be so many different experiences. Even if you're living in a high cost of living place like New York City, you could be extremely frugal and not spending that much money, or you could be living on a caviar budget. And this is true everywhere, even if you're living in the middle of nowhere. It's all about how you're managing your money and how much of your money you are deciding to spend and on what.
So starting off, the biggest expense that I have in New York City is rent. And if you know anything about living in New York City, you know that rent can get very expensive. Thankfully, I live with my boyfriend and we split rent down the middle. And in the time that I've lived in New York City, I've always tried to keep rent on the lower side by living with roommates or my partner. Currently, we live in Brooklyn, which is slightly cheaper depending on where you are in. But our total rent right now for a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom loft is $3,400, which I accidentally said $3,600 in my last video, but I checked today and it is $3,400. So my share of the rent comes out to $1,700 a month. Definitely the biggest chunk of my budget right now.
So I'm not really surprised at all that rent is her biggest expense, especially in New York City. So she's paying that $3,400 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment. So out where I live, which is pretty rural, for $3,400 a month, you're probably looking at a 4-bedroom house with a nice big yard and a huge kitchen for that. But then you're not getting the benefits of living in New York City. She also mentions that she's trying to be creative about where she lives so that she can keep that rent cost low, and also living with roommates. So this is a huge deal and it's a great way to lower expenses, and you can do this wherever you live. If you can take on roommates, this can lower your biggest expense, which is a huge deal anywhere you live.
So the next thing with apartment is utilities. So gas and electric. I think water is typically covered in New York City for most apartments, but utilities can range from $100 to $300. It's gone up to $400 sometimes during the winters. I've noticed living in New York City for a while that different apartments tend to use different amounts of electricity and gas, because in my old apartments I've spent anywhere from $20 to $70 a month, but in this current apartment that I'm living in and sharing with my boyfriend, it tends to be a little bit expensive.
So the tough thing about utilities is that it's hard to guesstimate how much they're going to be, because you just get the bill and then hope you have enough money to cover it. It's so true that different places can cost different amounts. And this is why when you're looking at places or houses, you should consider what the space is like and how the house is being heated and when it was built. So like, what's the insulation going to be like? So, and this can make thousands of dollars of difference for you every single year. So if it's a newer unit, it's more likely to be better insulated, which means your power bill could be less on a similar space that was built in the 70s. If the variability of your electric bill is really bothering you, you can call your electric company and see if they can average out your payments, and then each month you just pay that average instead of just dealing with the actual cost of electricity that month. And this is really useful in older places, because in the summer maybe you're paying $100 a month, but in the winter maybe it goes up to something ridiculous like $600 a month. But if they can even that payment out throughout the year, you know how much you owe, and then you don't have to wonder what's coming.
So the next variable expense that I've been trying to curb a lot is eating out, because eating out can get very, very expensive in New York City, especially when it comes to takeout, socializing, and going out with friends. When you live in New York City, the expenses for eating out can be so high, and I'm very tempted to get takeout all the time. And whenever I go and hang out with friends, eating is probably the number one thing that I end up doing. So I've been trying to find different ways around eating out all the time, including having friends over and cooking together, or finding other ways where I don't have to spend $50 on a brunch every weekend. But typically eating out, getting food and drinks costs me $200 on the lower end if I'm being super, super mindful of my budget. It is very hard for me to have a consistent $200 eating out budget every month. But on average, I'd say it's anywhere from $300 to $500.
So you could call this a pro, or you could call this a con of living in New York City, is that availability of all these cool options for eating. So there would really be no lack of cool new places to try, and while that is super neat, it can get really expensive. So it kind of depends on what your self-control is like and whether or not that's important to you. If the food scene is totally your thing and that is a really important thing in your budget, go for it. I mean, if you live there, you should take advantage of it if that's something that you move to the city for.
The other thing that is pretty much a guaranteed expense in New York City is transportation. Transportation is pretty straightforward because if you tap your card, MTA actually limits your weekly cost of transportation to $34. But in total, if I max out my subway transportation, it comes out to about $136.
So $136 for all your transportation for the entire month is amazing. If you have a car, you know that between the insurance and the gas, if you have a payment, you're looking at a lot more than that. And then you're just hoping that something doesn't break and you need $1,000 repair. So not having the hassle of maintaining a car and having all your transportation for $136 a month is glorious. So that's definitely something that I would say is actually cheaper in the city than it is when you are more rural, and you definitely need a car if you plan on ever going anywhere or getting to work.
One of the wild cards in terms of cost every month for me is my pet Moose, which I co-own with my boyfriend. And if you guys own a pet, you probably will know that vet bills and other expenses can add up really quickly in a month too. But generally, I do have to pay for pet insurance every month. And so that comes out to $64 because I also pay for my pets at home that live with my parents. But on months that we do have vet bills for Moose, it also can add up very, very quickly, even with insurance. So in the past, when Moose has needed surgery, it has been upwards of $1,000 a month, but on average, if we have a vet appointment here or there, it roughly comes out to $100. So I'm going to say we spend roughly $100 every month on Moose's basic care, insurance, food, and any toys that we get for him.
I think a lot of people underestimate how expensive it is to have a pet. So these vet bills that she's talking about that are random can be $1,000. That's a lot of money, and that's even with pet insurance. Because I was just gonna say, well, you should see if pet insurance makes sense so that you can kind of even out those costs of having the pet. Because everyone thinks it's cute to take home a puppy because they're so adorable, and I agree, they are so adorable. But you know, they're a 15-year commitment, and they are a budget commitment too. And you're looking at probably $200 a month minimum for a cat. And I would wager that dogs are even more expensive. If you have a dog, what do your expenses for your dog come out to on average each month?
I am also a big advocate of hobbies. And if you live in New York City, it's almost guaranteed that you'll pick up a new hobby here or there. Some of you who watch me will probably know that I love pottery, and that is just my place to go whenever I need somewhere to spend my time and relax. This is something that I do budget for every single month because I know that my membership at the pottery studio comes out to be $230. This does sound like a big expense, but I try to go into the pottery studio multiple times a week if I have time, and it's worth every penny because it does act like free therapy for me. And I do tend to go in there whenever I'm feeling stressed or whenever I want to make anything for my podcast or for my apartment. The one thing with the pottery studio is when I do fire and glaze anything, it does cost me an extra, I think 4 or 6 cents per cubic inch of the pottery piece. So I end up spending anywhere from $230 to $270 a month, depending on how many pieces that I make. But again, I think investing in your hobbies is so important. So I'm definitely not very stingy on my hobbies and anything I have an interest in.
This is so cool. I feel like a lot of people wait until their 40s, 50s, 60s before they think about what do I like to do? What do I like to create? But I feel like this can bring so much balance to your life. So for me, this looks like jazzercise and kind of an added bonus. It's also a workout. But I think hobbies are part of what makes us who we are as humans. And they can also, turn into more things later. She's talking about, working on her podcast there. And so they're great places to come up with ideas and, have kind of separate yourself from the everyday grind of working and cooking food and eating and all of those things, so that you can kind of start thinking about life in a different way and kind of separate yourself from everyday things.
The last thing, but definitely not the least, is all the miscellaneous expenses that I have in a month. If you know me in my personal life, you probably know that I'm not a huge spender or a huge splurger. So some months my miscellaneous expenses can be very, very minimal, but sometimes if there's a big event or something happening during the month, my miscellaneous expenses tend to go up. So this past month I had a few birthdays that my friends had, and generally when I go out or go to celebrate a birthday, it can add up pretty quickly. So I think in miscellaneous expenses, this kind of rounds out to being probably $150 on average for random stuff.
This is a great amount for a miscellaneous budget, and she's really reining it in, honestly, because miscellaneous can get out of control fast. My miscellaneous budget is a lot more than this. I think this is a category we should be really mindful in because things just snowball and they just seem to happen, and then before you know it, and then this birthday celebration costs $100, and then we had people over, and that was another $50 or stuff like that. You might be thinking that New York is a super unaffordable city and you couldn't do it, but this proves that you really can. And this isn't just staying at home and never doing anything or never having any fun. There's quite a bit of fun in this budget, but it's also very reasonable. If you could live anywhere, what would your dream city be? If you like videos like this, be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Bye for now.